Hi everyone. Today our group will be presenting on the topic discrimination and bias against Muslims. To begin with, we'll start with the summary of the article that you all read. The article, 2 decades after 9/11, emphasizes the effect 9/11 has left on the already discriminated Muslim community. The problem is the effect still lingers on. American Muslims that grew up in the shadow of 9/11 has been subject to hostility, misconduct, mistrust, suspicion as terrorists because of their faith in Islam, and doubts over their Americanness. Muslim as a religion has been identity setter for its association with Islam. For example, it is commonly believed that a Muslim person is in support of all the ideologies of terrorist groups, especially the belief that the entire world needs to be converted to Islam. Hence, it is commonly believed that all the Muslims are terrorists. Upon survey, 53% of Americans had unfavorable views towards Muslim, in contrast to the favorable views for other religions such as Christianity and Judaism. However, the discrimination and bias towards Muslim community did not begin with 9/11, which we'll be talking about more in the historical aspects. In reality, 9/11 has become an excuse to validate the discrimination and bias. Visible bias and discrimination takes place in the form of name calling, such as terrorists, and accusation of being part of them, taking extra precautionary measures solely because of the religion, violating privacy, and validating the hatred in the name of suffering that Americans went through because of 9/11. The constant discrimination has forced Muslims to question their identity as Muslim, American, or American Muslim. Many Americans have also felt unsafe as any other dominant identity, such as the nationality. Over here, Americanness was ignored, and the entire focus has been shifted to the recessive identities such as race, religion, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. Nonetheless, Muslims have been courageous in dealing with this sort of harassment. The article tells stories of victimized Muslims and their way of dealing with the injustice. These examples give face to the numbers. These Muslims, unlike many others, have fought the bias, defined their personal identity, built bridges, challenged stereotypes, and taken a step to create their space on the table, to make America their nation too. Muslims are made to feel that they need to prove and highlight their American nationality to be safe and considered as part of in-group. As you can see in the picture, a Muslim woman is wearing a headscarf of American flag because she needs to portray that as much as she is a Muslim, she is American too. There are some Muslims who have felt obligated to answer the rising questions, which are sometimes offensive as well, about Islam as a faith for Muslims, to take a step to build the bridge and clear misconceptions. Now, Camilla will dive into the historical aspects of discrimination towards Muslims.
To move on to the historical connections section of our presentation, before I begin, I would like to first give a trigger warning that some of the content that is to come may be unsettling and uncomfortable for some listeners. So I wanted to make that statement before I began. So throughout history, Muslim identifying people have been a consistent target under white and/or colonial empires. In a more global perspective, I would like to begin with France before I get into a more US-centric focus. France's government historically has attempted to ban various strong aspects of the Muslim identity. Throughout French colonization of North Africa, the country's relationship with Arab-identifying individuals is quite tense. In the early 1800s, the French Islamic Empire was established and concentrated in North Africa, and for centuries since, France has been imposing Western white ideologies onto Muslim communities that reside both within and outside of its borders. More recently, France's government has tried to ban girls under 18 from wearing a hijab, as well as banning mothers who wear a hijab from traveling with their children on school field trips. In China, it came to certain global media attention that the country is committing a genocide of the Uyghurs, a Muslim population of people who stand at about 12 million today. The United States', UK's, and Canadian governments are only a few of the global governments that have acknowledged this. The US Secretary of State made a statement that China is committing genocide and crimes against humanity. Now, in a more US-centric focus, I would like to begin with the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. This act demonized the Muslim American community and actively targeted many. It allowed for the social and political activity of Muslim Americans to be actively investigated and allowed for the deportation of many Muslims on true and false accusations based on their involvement in terrorist activity. Post 9/11 actions that the US government took were to begin significant increase in surveillance, as well as Bush's government allowing for spying to occur on everyday Americans, as well as the secret detainment of men from Muslim and Arab countries. Next, there was the deployment of troops in the Middle East, specifically in Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and Iraq. And ultimately, the attacks on September 11th situated Muslim Americans at the forefront of the national discourse. In more recent news, there is Trump's Muslim ban. In 2016, during Trump's campaign, Muslim Americans were again being targeted as Trump called for a ban on Muslims from entering the country, a national database of all Muslims, and the wholesale surveillance of mosques. Ultimately, the effects that this historic treatment and stigmatization has on Muslim Americans is leaving too many community members with examined anxiety and depression rates among more than 600 adult Arab Americans in 35 states, which are rates higher than those of the general public and other minority groups, citing ongoing racial profiling, discrimination, and other stressors unique to Arabs. To discuss the hate speech and crimes against the Muslim community, I would like to first focus in on a more US-centric focus. To begin, various Republican politicians have stated hateful things against having a Muslim American president. For example, Ben Carson, believing that it is unconstitutional to have a sitting Muslim identifying president. There is also the bombing in Oklahoma City. After a federal building had been bombed in 1995, many speculated that it was the doings of Muslim terrorists. But after the terrorist was found, his name was Timothy McVeigh, who was a white Christian male. No one who was Muslim identifying was involved. And lastly, there are the Chapel Hill murders. On February 10th, 2015, 3 Muslim college students were murdered by Craig Stephen Hicks, a white male who was understood to have been living in their apartment complex. He shot and killed them quickly after they opened their apartment door due to the fact that he sounded their doorbell. In a more worldwide perspective, going back to China, there have been accusations and testimonies told by concentration camp survivors that China, aside from demonizing its Muslim population, has been targeting Muslim regions and has been targeting religious figures, banning religious practices as well, and as well as destroying mosques and tombs. And lastly, there is Al-Aqsa Mosque. In more recent news, this past May, the Israeli military fired a rain of rubber bullets onto Muslim Palestinians who were worshiping at Al-Aqsa Mosque in light of Eid, as well as burned centuries-old trees that stood outside of the mosque. This violence invited hateful individuals to stampede into the mosque and attack Muslim Palestinians who were simply praying.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm here to talk about how the article relates back To the class materials, obviously, one of the major topics the article relates back to is the concept of prejudice. In this case, negatively biased attitudes towards Muslim people that vastly increased in 2001 due to the 9/11 attacks. The most notable example of the scene in the article is when it talks about at the very beginning the two little girls wearing hijabs who were spat at and called terrorists weeks after the 9/11 attack. These types of attacks, whether they are explicit, like in this case, or implicit or done unknowingly, all those create barriers to healthy diversity and equality, as well as acceptance. Also, post 9/11 prejudice can be associated with the need for closure scale, where paranoia fueled prejudice led to a decent number of citizens of the United States to have external and implicit prejudice towards Muslims based purely on racist stereotypes and jump to conclusions. And those type of thinking continues to today. Then also there's the self-serving bias, which can arise from hostility due to fear and defensiveness, which also led to attributing threats to Muslim characteristics such as skin color, clothing, and religion, wanting threat gone due to just looks, instead of judging at Muslim Americans situationally, and realizing that the vast majority of Muslim Americans are peaceful and are just as stressed and confused and threatened after 9/11 as any other American. And as seen in this chart here, anti-Muslim assaults really popped off in 2001 due to 9/11 and stayed relatively low. Still not great, obviously, throughout the 2000s to mid 2010s, and then jumped in 2016 due to a large part of the xenophobia caused by Donald Trump and other attacks done by Islamic terrorists. All right, more connections to the class. The ultimate attribution error where Americans Muslims based off of stereotypes and characteristics of the group that are shared with actual Islamic terrorist groups, such as the same religion or clothing practices, and that's about it. But Americans still associate a normal Muslim with these specifically violent movements that abuse Islam, such as Al Qaeda or ISIS, especially after 9/11. And many American minds Muslims began to pose a realistic threat due to how direct of an attack 9/11 was on the USA, and also a symbolic threat, as they were seen as threats to American values and Christian values, are very prevalent in American society back then and today. This perceived threat continues to today and spikes whenever there is an attack perpetrated by Islamic terrorists or in Muslims are prevalent in the news cycle, such as when Donald Trump had the travel ban in 2016 and 2017. As for the type of prejudice, we can see subtle prejudice, with the justification being the practice of Islam itself or the cultural practices that come with it, such as wearing a face veil. This lays the groundwork for blatant prejudice seen most recently in 2016 and 2017. As I just mentioned, when Donald Trump excluded immigration from several Muslim countries, which, as shown in the chart that was in the previous slide, led to even higher attacks on Muslims than post 9/11. And also, media has played a significant role in how Muslims are seen by the American public. For example, if a person often sees Muslims associated with terrorists on the news or in other media, over time, a link will be created in the brain in which, when you encounter a Muslim person, you'll think of terrorism. And this is obviously detrimental to all Muslims. This is just another chart that shows the amount of Muslim attacks per year, specific attacks associated with Islamic terrorists, and the types of attacks they committed, ranging from opposition to refugee settlements, purple, to blue being media reports of anti-Muslim violence and hate crimes. All right, the 4 parts of stigmatized social status against Muslims, labeling, Muslims no longer being considered as other Americans, just Muslims or immigrants, even if they aren't recent immigrants. Stereotyping, attaching domestic terrorism or extreme jihad practices to all Muslims because of terrorist attacks created by actual terrorists. Disconnection, labeling non-Muslim Americans as us, and Muslim Americans as them, which is similar to labeling, but also the added attribute of being not associating with the other group at all based on prejudice. And status loss and discrimination. So discriminating the labeled group further, giving rise to greater social inequality, and basically reducing Muslims to threats to democracy. And we can see this in the reading when the girls in hijabs were spat at and yelled at, or Muslim kids being asked where's bin Laden when giving a presentation about their religion and culture, or being harassed by the TSA at the airport. And final points, race-based rejection, sensitivity, anxiety, or expectation to be rejected because of one's race, being rebuffed on other, such as, like an example would be being rebuffed on the playground due to being Muslim, or being harassed at the airport due to being Muslim. And lastly, ethnic identity can provide a protective shield to stigmatized groups, Muslims in this case. In the article, Shahana Hanif being proud of her identity and thinking of herself as a warrior, and her community being proud of their identity. Or Shukriolo, who didn't change anything about her identity and continued to run for King County Council District 5. And yeah, on to the next part.
Okay, so proposed solutions and future directions. Adding more diversity in powerful political positions can promote policy change and support for institutions that embrace diversity or provide support for marginalized groups. Promoting narratives of marginalized groups through TED Talks, literature, and just providing a platform for those of marginalized identities and groups to voice their stories and share their stories. Including diversity in early childhood media can help to reduce effects of racial bias, which we learned about in the first week. Opening conversation beyond discrimination and bias faced by Muslim Americans and providing opportunity to discuss differences within the social group can help those retain a sense of personal identity when they're being threatened as a group. But also discussing similarities between ethnic groups can also promote unity at the same time. Developing interventions that focus on reducing stereotype threats would also be helpful, and this could be characterized by learning how to build habits such as attributing arousal one may be experiencing as a result of a stereotype to another cause, learning how to help marginalized group members acknowledge and appreciate their personal identity and individuality, engaging in activities that can help assert positive identity and further reduce likelihood of internalizing stigma, learning or teaching racial socialization strategies such as racial pride, and it also acknowledging intersectionality, which is also a very huge way to help kind of learn and understand the bias and discrimination faced by marginalized groups. Restructuring academic institutions as well as other institutions can also be very helpful. We can implement courses with focus on implications of dominant cultural narratives in the US, as well as learning and helping others understand its intention of inserting control and oppressing racialized groups, providing training for academic, law enforcement, and medical professionals can also help to gain multicultural competencies by directly interacting and working with those of marginalized populations. Would provide a lot of support and help to marginalized groups, and change in the media institution as well, which was definitely a very pivotal part of the uptake in discrimination post 9/11 towards a specific group. So maybe obtaining resources for more diverse organization and groups of people instead of, solely law enforcement would definitely help reduce bias in media coverage, and also focusing coverage on the event itself and its impact on society or a nation instead of just focusing on the criminal can also help reduce the likelihood of stigma. So here are our references, and our references continued, and here are our discussion questions. So I'll read them out loud now, and then we'll discuss them once we come back into the room. So how can the tragic event of 9/11 impact identity salience for members of the Muslim American community? How significant did the role of media play into bias and discrimination against the Muslim American community after 9/11? And then Muslims are the main racial group that have to deal with being grouped together with terrorists. And what unique psychological effects do you guys think this would have on how Muslims interact with others and how they are interacted with? And how can we restructure media, academic, or legal institutions to reduce levels of bias and discrimination towards the Muslim American community as well? Thank you.